Hello, welcome back to Storytime. My name's Josh. Thank you so much for being here. Hope you're excited and ready for another fun story. Another one in the Mr. Men library. This one's called Mr. Greedy. It's not very good to be greedy, so let's find out what this story is about. I hope you're ready and comfortable, because we're about to delve into story time. Alright. Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat, and the more he ate, the fatter he became. And the trouble was, the fatter he became, the more hungry he became. And the more hungry he became, the more he ate. And the more he ate, the fatter he became. And so it went on. Look at Mr. Greedy there. Got a cake in hand. Mr. Greedy lived in a house that looked rather like himself. It was a roly-poly sort of house. Now have a look at Mr. Greedy's house there. A roly-poly sort of house, it says. I guess it's because it's a bit round. Round edges, you know. One morning, Mr. Greedy awoke, rather earlier than usual. He'd been dreaming about food, as usual, and that had made him wake up feeling hungry. As usual. So Mr. Greedy got up, went downstairs, and he ate the most enormous breakfast. It's Mr. Greedy sleeping there. And then he wakes up, goes down to make himself a big old breakfast. I don't know about you, but I like big breakfasts as well. I'm always hungry when I wake up in the morning. This is what Mr. Greedy had for his breakfast. Toast, 2 slices. Cornflakes, 1 packet. Milk, 1 bottle. Sugar, 1 bowlful. Toast, 3 slices. Eggs, 3 boiled. Toast, again 4 slices. Butter, 1 dish. And marmalade, 1 pot. Wow, that's a lot of food. When he had finished his enormous breakfast, Mr. Greedy sat back in his chair, smiled a very satisfied smile, and thought, "That was a delicious breakfast," he thought to himself. "Now I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch." Mr. Greedy just finished breakfast, and now he's thinking about lunch. I do that sometimes. He decided in order to work up an appetite for lunch, he would go for a long walk. That's a good idea. Get some exercise. That morning, Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked. Then he discovered a cave. That's funny, he thought. I don't remember seeing that there before. That's Mr. Greedy walking along there. Big old belly. Wonder what he's going to find. Being a curious sort of fellow, Mr. Greedy decided to explore. He entered the dark cave. Inside, he discovered some giant steps leading upwards. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to climb them. They were very steep and very difficult to climb. But with much huffing and puffing, Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. That's him there at the bottom of the steps. Got to climb up there. At the top of the steps, Mr. Greedy came to a door. It was without doubt the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen. And it wasn't quite shut. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to see what was on the other side of that door. So Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack in the door, and there before him was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world. Wow. Look, Mr. Greedy. A curious sort of fellow, they say, going through the door. The floor was as big as a field. The table in the middle of the floor was as big as a house, and the chairs around it were as high as trees. Mr. Greedy felt very small. Then he sniffed. Coming from somewhere up on top of that gigantic table was the most delicious foody smell that Mr. Greedy had ever smelled. Wow. Sounds like Mr. Greedy's kind of place. If the lunch is also big like everything else in the room, he might be in for a A fun little lunch since he likes to eat so much, eh? Mr. Greedy sniffed again and then decided that he must get up onto that table. So he began to climb up the leg of the enormous chair. It was very difficult and it took him a long time, but eventually Mr. Greedy stood on the table. Everything was larger than life. The salt and pepper pots were both as big as pillar boxes. Look at the size of the salt and the pepper there. Wow. Mr. Greedy, it's just as big as Mr. Greedy. Wow. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, and Mr. Greedy tried to lift one of the oranges. You can't even see Mr. Greedy, he looks like the orange. Wow. Wonder what else he's going to find. And Mr. Greedy, being Mr. Greedy, took a bite out of one of the apples there. Then he looked around. Look at that tiny little bite he did on that apple. Over on the other side of the table stood the source of that delicious smell. Not sauce as in sauce that you put on top of food, but sauce as in what he's looking for. It's where the source of the smell. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. And on the plate, huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal sausages, the size of pillows. And huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal potatoes, the size of beach balls. And huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal peas, the size of cabbages. Whoa. Mr. Greedy hurried across the table towards the plate. He would have waddled along. Being Mr. Greedy, he began to eat. Look at him there at the edge of the plate. It's bigger than him. He's going to be stoked. Look at that. Suddenly a shadow fell across the plate, and Mr. Greedy found himself being picked up by a giant hand and looking into the eyes of a real-life giant. "And who," thundered the giant, "are you?" Mr. Greedy was so frightened that he could only just manage to squeeze his name. "Mr. Greedy?" he squeaked. The giant laughed as loud as thunder. "Greedy by name and greedy by nature," he bellowed. "Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, that you need to be taught a lesson." That'd be scary. Can you imagine being held in the hands of a giant? Whoa. It's like if you've ever seen Transformers, how they're so huge, like giants, and they can hold little humans in their hand like this. It's like that. It'd be scary. And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on that huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. When he had finished, Mr. Greedy felt very ill indeed, as if he would burst at any minute. "Now," said the giant in a much quieter voice, "do you promise never to be greedy again?" "Oh yes," moaned Mr. Greedy. "I promise." Look at the size of the giant compared to Mr. Greedy. Wow. "Very well," said the giant. "Then I'll let you go." Mr. Greedy climbed down from the table and went out through the door, feeling very fat and extremely miserable. Look, he's even got a little sad face there. Not super happy anymore. Have you ever eaten so much that you feel sick? Yeah. It sucks. It's not very nice. And do you know, from that day to this, Mr. Greedy has kept his promise. And do you know something else as well? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to look anymore. He now looks like this, which I think suits him a lot better, don't you? Look, it's Mr. Greedy there, looking all thin, looking cool, looking awesome, and not as greedy. So, if you know anybody who's as greedy as Mr. Greedy, or he used to be, you know what to tell them, don't you? Beware of giants. That's a good one. Well, there you go, everyone. That's another book done in the Mr. Men library. Mr. Greedy. And we're going to be on to the next story very soon. It's called Mr. Happy. That sounds like it'll be fun. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now, but not forever. See you soon. And if you like watching these, please subscribe.